Thank you for having me here today. I will try to widen the perspective. We have been talking about risk, and the topic of my talk is going to be the opportunity with assets. Of course, there's a risk as well, but we're going to focus mainly on the opportunity. If I get this to work, right. First of all, I'd like to challenge your view on public assets. More specifically on public commercial assets. We have been and we will be listening to people who are managing the one side of the balance sheet. We are very used to talking about the liability side of the balance sheet, or the debt side at least. But the asset side is somewhat forgotten in most governments, and especially to realize how huge it is. The IMF has made some research and found that it's often 2 times the value of GDP. And I would like to add real estate to that equation, which would probably lead to that all governments around the world will have assets worth 3 times GDP. That is a lot of assets, which we are not managing in almost all countries except barred for one in this room at least, which is Singapore. And there's a lot of revenues that we can generate from this if we manage these professionally. I will use Singapore a lot as an example for a very obvious reasons, because they are a leader in this field. Why do we want to manage public assets? It could generate a lot of revenues if managed professionally. It could generate as much as 3 times GDP, 3% of GDP. I would probably venture to say it could even be more, but let's keep it to what the IMF research has found on this subject. It will help you to improve debt sustainability. And in some countries that are relying on natural resources, it could also help you to diversify your economy. And of course, when it comes to SOEs, but also to real estate, it will increase productivity once you start managing these much more professionally, and growth, investments, etc. And to relate to the previous topic, it will reduce fiscal risk. And of course, corruption, which is a big part of the whole management of public assets. I mentioned Singapore, and it's indeed an amazing example, because Singapore, when it gained independence some 50 years ago, it took a radical step. At that time, it was on par in terms of econometric numbers with Jamaica. But today, the 2 countries and the 2 economies are wide apart. And one of the reasons for this is that Singapore decided to manage its public assets very professionally, which means then to take out the public assets into separate holding companies to be managed independently from policymaking by professionals. And this led to the fact that Singapore was able to go from a developing country to a developed economy in one single generation. In order to manage anything, we need to have accurate numbers. We need to have data. I like this picture because it's a nilometer, 3,000 years old, from Egypt, that measured the water level in the Nile, which was essential, crucial. It was the economy of Egypt. To be able to measure this not only helped you to understand call it the GDP. If the Nile was the economy, because that determined how much, how the agrarian economy developed. But it was also a way to gauge how much tax we could collect that year. Public commercial assets is one part of public assets, and it's those assets that do not need tax to be sustained. They actually generate revenues externally in some way. So you have roads, if toll roads, you have transportation, railways, airports, shipping, utilities, energy and water, and in some countries you even have banks and insurance companies, etc. This is one part, and the most famous one. At the national level, they're called SOEs. I'm not really fond of calling them SOEs because we focus too much on what we call SOEs. I prefer to call them operational assets because the biggest part of public commercial assets on the operational side is at the local and regional level. But most countries, and in this room when we talk about fiscal risk, we usually only talk about SOEs, or national operational assets, or operational assets at the national level. But it's like the iceberg. I had the iceberg as the first picture. I will come back to the iceberg over and over again, because that is basically the picture that you should have in mind when you think about public commercial assets. It's an iceberg. Huge commercial risk if you don't manage them, but a huge opportunity because it contains a lot of water, which is a resource. The real big part of this, which is under the surface, which most countries don't even see, is real estate. This is the real hidden gem. And the IMF, as always, have done a lot of research, and there's one of my favorite economists at the IMF, his name is Vito Tanzi. Instead of writing a long, boring report about this topic, many years ago, he wrote a report saying, I walked down Copacabana, and among these, this is the most expensive street in Brazil, in Latin America. It's just next to the famous beach. So when I walked there, there were high-rise buildings, beautiful 5-star hotels, and in the middle of everything was a small local municipality school. And as an economist, he saw this is a waste of money. The government that owns this should move the school, build a house, make money from renting it out as a hotel, and the school could instead get money for 10 times what the value or the cost of that school today. And the pupils would not be deprived of a nice facility. Instead, they probably would be able to concentrate on their work instead of looking at the beach and longing that they were somewhere else. It all comes down to accounting. I like accounting. I know most people don't, but accounting is essential. It's it's quite fun. Because with proper accounting, you will see life differently. For an economist, when they see a parking lot, they see only the cash that comes in. When you talk to a mayor and you talk parking lots, the only thing the mayor and the treasurer in that city sees is the revenues that comes in from the parking revenues. Nothing else. As a former banker, I see a house, or a potential house. I see value in building a house, and in the basement, I will build 3 floors of parking spaces that will generate 3 times as much revenues from the parking, 10 times from the offices, and then 5 times from the residential apartments that I will have at the top. That's what I see. That's the opportunity. That's public asset management for you. Every city in the world, every government are sitting on an absolute gold mine of assets. When I visit a country or I visit a city, You meet with the mayor and says, you have an opportunity here. Oh, that's very interesting. I used to be a banker, so I know exactly what you're talking about. But the fact is that we don't have any buildings. We don't have, all the buildings that we have, we use for our administration. The mayor of Boston said exactly this. We have about 300 properties in our city. But we had done the asset map, the indicative valuation of his real estate, and found that he has 12,000 properties. 12,000 instead of 300. That was the reality. In his books, the book value was almost negligible. The mayor of Pittsburgh said the same thing. The value of the indicative value in the city of Pittsburgh was 70 times the book value. Now imagine if you were a CEO of a listed company and you didn't mark your real estate to market. You would be taken over by any corporate rate or private equity. Any arbitrageur would take over your company, sell off the real estate, and make a fortune, and keep the operations. But Los Angeles, Chicago, Boston, Jakarta, any place where you come from will. UK prides itself to have the best balance sheet, the best accounting in the world. The reality is that they don't. They have a problem with transport. COVID has stressed this even more because there has been no people using public transport during COVID. So basically, most subways in the world, from San Francisco, London, New York, to anywhere in Asia, has had financial problems because there's been no revenues. And the London subways are no exemption for that, apart from that they've had financial troubles for probably 20 years. The reality is that they are sitting on properties that could solve all this, but they can't find them. Their book value is worth 17 to 20 billion. The reality is probably, we haven't done a proper evaluation, but the indicative value is probably 80 to 100 billion, which would solve every problem that they have. You don't need to sell them, you just need to manage them better so that we get the revenues that we were talking about from the parking spaces, the offices, the residential apartments that we build. On a UK scale, this means that probably the UK government has not found, they are sitting on a gold mine of worth of 1.5 trillion. Yes, 1.5 trillion pounds. They're now trying to, the IMF has just criticized the UK government for lowering taxes and increasing and paying that by debt. Instead, they could have used the real estate that they own, managed it better, and they would have earned 15 billion per year, easily. It all comes down to accounting, accrual accounting. Accrual accounting from the budgeting to appropriations all the way to the reporting. This has to be integrated. It doesn't matter that you produce a balance sheet if that is not integrated with the budgeting, because then the balance sheet is meaningless. Accrual accounting was invented 1,000 years ago, but it wasn't until that invention came to the Italian city-state that it became this dynamic tool that actually created capitalism, capital markets, and the wealth that we have enjoyed today, thanks to the private sector. And New Zealand was the first country in the world to introduce this 30 years ago. And they have since enjoyed a very stable financial development. in their government finances, focusing on net worth, not on GDP over debt, debt over GDP, or fiscal deficit or surpluses, but actually seeing, are we creating wealth? When we are investing, are we actually adding value to our balance sheet? So again, I'm glad nobody from the UK government is here, but I don't mind saying this. But the UK is probably the most researched country in the world. There's few countries that have done so much research about privatizations, about debt and balance sheets, etc. So that's why the UK figures a lot, together with New Zealand and Singapore. But when you have a liquidity problem, it's very easy for a government to say, let's find some assets and plug the hole by selling them. Because that's how you see it. As an economist, you see cash. So when you have a cash problem, you sell an asset. But the important thing is, and they did in the UK, we did this with the water companies, which was a horrible waste of money, because they were able to generate so much money for the private sector, which the government could have done if they were able to manage these professionally. But the point is that when you invest, they did it because there was a lot of investment needed in the water system. And they felt that if we make this investment, debt over GDP is going to be increased. But if you would have instead had the measurement net worth, you would have seen that these are very profitable, these are very valuable investments that we make. So there's no reason for the rating institutes or for the people measuring or valuing our risk to see anything bad with us. But changing the accounting system can take a long time. New Zealand did it in about 1.5 years, and so can you. But in the meantime, there is a very quick way to do this and make money out of your assets. And that is by doing an asset map. That shouldn't take more than 3 months, just to get an indicative valuation of how much assets do you actually have. And the UK again, and this time it's in a good way. The UK actually did the first asset map, at least probably in the world, but at least in Europe, 1,000 years ago, almost 1,000 years ago, by horse. So I'm sure that in your country you could also do this, an indicative valuation, an indicative estimate, a feasibility study, what you actually own in 3 to 6 months. It shouldn't take more, because if it does, you will run into all kinds of problems, political problems. So for those of you who want to join the workshop, what you can consider until then is, what does data look in your country? How much value can you actually find? Do you have a balance sheet? If you do have a balance sheet, what does it look like? How is it like Pittsburgh? Are we missing a lot of the real estate? Are we missing a lot of the, what does the land registry look like? Is it analog? Is it digital? How is the statistical agency in my country? How much value have we actually captured? And the second phase is putting these assets in proper institutions. We have done the debt management in a debt management institution, debt management office. We have the central bank who manages the interest rate in a professional institution, independent from policy making, hopefully. Now, the next step is put the asset management in a professional agency or a professional holding company, as the Singaporeans did when they put all the public commercial assets inside a holding company called Temasek, which is the model for all these discussions. And the genius behind it was Mr. Goh Keng Swee, who was the vice premier during this the start of the Singapore government. And the holding company is your unit that makes it possible for a government to actually deal with the private sector. It is the bridge to the private sector. And it takes away the risk of an undue transfer of public wealth to the private sector, which always happens in privatization. I've been an investment banker for 20 years, and I have seen enough. I've done privatizations in many parts of the world, and it's always the easiest way for the private sector to become rich. If you want to be rich, you should buy assets from the government, because they are always undervalued, and the government don't have a way of managing risk, which means that they are very happy to offload that risk, like in a PPP, which means that public wealth will be transferred to the private sector. So putting it at arm's length distance is the way to manage that risk and thereby capturing the value and the upside. And there are two types of holding companies. One is for liquid assets, and that is a sovereign wealth fund, which is the GIC of Singapore. And for public commercial assets, which is a completely different animal, it's a completely different management technique, then you have a public wealth fund. And once inside that, it's possible to manage assets, maximize their value, and if you want, when they have reached maximum value, you can privatize them, but then you do it in a way and use the same technique as the private sector. So you're not, you don't have a weaker position than the private sector buyer. And this is really, really important. And you need to set these vehicles up in a professional way so that they actually imitate the private sector, because they have had 800 years to refine accounting, governance, risk management, which we don't have in the public sector. And it needs to be combined, commercial objective with proper accounting and independence. And it looks like a very nice car. But that's the kind of quality you want in a holding company. So for the workshop, perhaps you could consider, what does it look like? What does ownership look like? Where are the opportunities? The workshop should focus on opportunity. So the first one is, how big is the opportunity in my country? Is it 100% of GDP, 200, 300? Because we haven't registered anything, which is very likely. Where is the opportunity? Mainly on national level, because the national government owns everything, or we are a federal country, which I believe places like Indonesia. So the opportunity might be has to be on a local or regional level. And some of the examples are, of course, Singapore, which transformed the country from a developing to a developed country. 14% ROE from Temasek over 46 years. Sweden, I was fortunate or unfortunate enough to lead the transformation of the Swedish public sector, a project over 3 years, when Sweden was almost bankrupt, and we had to do this. Otherwise, the IMF and everybody else has told us we need to privatize. So when the Swedish government didn't want to privatize, so they decided to manage them instead and get a yield from it. And it was very successful. It outperformed the stock market and worked quite well. Another wonderful example is Hong Kong, that actually built one of the largest and the most efficient subway in the world, MTR, the Hong Kong subway, without one tax dollar. It was all done by developing the real estate above the stations. In Sweden, we did something similar when we created property companies from various departments, Ministry of Transport, the railways, the telecom, etc. And that paid for huge infrastructure investments in Sweden as part of the restructuring of the public sector assets. London did something similar with some of their stations, and which also paid for the Olympic Games. Denmark and Hamburg had harbors that were obsolete because of container traffic, made it more profitable to create a bigger harbor outside of the city center, which left the city center with a huge old harbor that you can transform into housing, to offices, to universities, etc. And this created huge opportunities for the city and basically expanded the geographic space of the city with 1/3. And we did something similar with our real estate. So the third question for you is really, leading with a pilot is always very clever. What is a potential pilot for you? Is it a city harbor in one of your cities? Is it the Ministry of Transport? Is it the Ministry of Health? Because hospitals have huge amount of real estate. Just have a think, and we'll try to do a small discussion about this, about the opportunities in your country, and share them with everybody else. Thank you.